Welcome to everyone who's joined us today for this morning's discussion. This event is part of Global Matters, a live stream series unpacking global issues and their impact on the Australian economy and society. My name's Jill Carter and I'm the Director of People and Culture here at CEDA, and I'm delighted to be the host and moderator for today's session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking to you today, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today across Australia. Before I introduce our speakers today, I'd like to let you know how you can actively participate in the conversation today. You can submit your questions to the panel by using the Pigeonhole app. The details are currently appearing on the screen. And you can also view all of the questions that are submitted and vote on them. And that makes sure that I'm asking the questions that are most important to you on the live stream today, and will ensure that we get the widest reach. So, judging by how many of you registered for today's Global Matters live stream, there's more than a few of us that quite like the sound of a 4-day work week, and that's not surprising. Post-pandemic, there's been a significant shift in the workplace landscape. It's changed the way employees view their jobs and their expectations of the workplace. And I'm sure many of you are already seeing that employers are seeking more flexibility and balance from their employers. In response, hundreds of companies are now globally participating in trials or experimenting with adopting a 4-day work week and how it can be successfully adopted. As you'll hear today, the trials are yielding compelling results: productivity gains, reduced sick days, lower staff turnover, to name just a few. So today, I'm excited to be speaking with the OG experts on the 4-day work week and unpack some of the trials and many of the benefits. So let's dive in. I'm going to introduce each of our panel in turn and ask them to make some opening remarks. And then we're going to open the discussion more broadly with questions from you on the live stream. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Charlotte Lockhart, who's the Managing Director and founder of the 4-day work week. Morning, Charlotte. So can we start? Can you describe a little bit about the background of the 4-day work week movement? How did it start? And maybe if you could comment on what sort of organisations took part in the pilots and what attracted them to being part of these initial studies.
Yeah, so the 4-day work week journey started for us because we introduced it in our own company, Perpetual Guardian, back in 2018. And interestingly, there were people who were already discussing this prior to that, including Juliet Schor, who is on the call today, who's been, as I say, banging on about it since the 90s, but it is, as with anything in life, a journey that needs its own moment in time to come to fruition. So Andrew Barnes and I set up 4-day week global really as a vehicle to host all of the conversations about reducing work time, and we were having conversations with academics and businesses, governments, all sorts of people that were doing that. And through that, we started getting quite a lot of attention. So we started running pilot programs. Rather than just helping companies individually, we started to run these group pilot programs, which we did throughout last year. And Professor Schor was the lead researcher that established our framework for that, so that we could keep an eye on things. And John has come in specifically for the Australian market. So that's really what we're talking about. So the types of companies that are joining, so in our group pilot programs, they are mostly in the SME market, but we do have other organisations that tend not to talk about it too loudly, that are much larger. The ones in Australia that people will be aware of, UNICEF and recently Oxfam as well. So it is a conversation that really has got traction.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. I'd now like to bring Professor Juliet Schor into the conversation. She's an economist and sociologist at Boston College. And reading the report, Juliet, the results clearly indicate a number of economic benefits for the 4-day work week. Could you tell us a bit about that and perhaps include some commentary on global trends? And I'd also really be interested to hear about any results that surprised you that came out of that report.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Very excited about all the conversations that are going on in Australia and New Zealand right now on this topic. So we looked at a lot of measures. We had a wide range of employee outcomes that we looked at, variety of well-being outcomes, work-related outcomes, and then also data from the companies. And because there are so many small companies, and because they're across such a wide range of industries, so whether we're talking professional services, probably the biggest group, nonprofits, we have manufacturing and construction, of course, finance, and software technology, but food service also, healthcare. It's hard to get a common metric. So we asked them for a small number of things that we thought they all would have: revenue, absenteeism, attrition, a big thing that employers are facing today, people leaving, and new hiring. So on all of these metrics, we're seeing a great deal of success, varying a little bit across the trials. So that's the global perspective. We are now in our 7th trial. But I think in some ways the proof is in the pudding, which is that only a handful of the companies that we have been working with, and we're, I think, probably close to 200 different companies now in these trials, only a handful have decided not to continue. I mean, really probably can count on the fingers of maybe one, possibly 2 hands. So very, very successful from the company's point of view. Employee well-being results have been off the charts. I mean, just really fantastic. The thing that didn't surprise me, what did surprise me is probably the fact that we don't see people taking on second jobs on that day off. I thought that might be something we'd see. And in our big sort of before and after methodology, where we survey people about work intensity before and then after, we're not seeing an increase. So this isn't to speed up the model of work reorganization pioneered by 4-Day Week Global actually works.
Thanks, Juliet. And finally, I'd like to introduce Professor John Quiggin. He's Laureate Fellow of School of Economics, Faculty of Business and Economics and Law at the University of Queensland. Welcome, John. I'd be really interested to ask you, you've been running the local trials here in Australasia. Can you tell us about it in the Australian context? How have the trials gone, and have you found anything different about the Australian context to the global context?
Sure. So I'd like to also acknowledge the Jagera and Turrbal people from whose land I'm speaking. I haven't really been directly involved in the running of the trial, so I've mainly at this stage wanted to give a historical perspective. The 4-day week seems like a radical shift, but really it's the last 30 or 40 years during which working hours have remained essentially unchanged that's the historical anomaly. Australia and New Zealand took the lead in shortening working hours in the mid-19th century, and from then until really the 1980s, we saw a steady reduction in standard hours of work, and that was reversed by a bunch of economic developments then, and indeed work intensity and working hours increased quite a lot in the 1990s. There's been gradual pushback against that, but we still haven't had fundamental changes. So we've really had 40 years in which productivity has increased very substantially, but in which none of that increase has been taken the form of a reduction in standard full-time working hours. So in that sense, we've part of the reason we're seeing this now that the pressure of unemployment has been reduced is simply that this is what we would have expected workers to want over the last 40 years. They haven't got it for a lot of reasons, but I think not because people really just want to spend more time working and or accumulating more and more goods that they have no time to spend time with, as well as their families. So I want to emphasise, I guess, the naturalness of this development and the fact, and that it's that the kinds of pressures we're seeing that Juliet's talked about and that are being relieved by a 4-day week, that's something we should have expected to happen a long time ago.
Thanks, John. I have quite a lot of questions here, but before I jump into those, I'd just like to remind everybody that you can log into the Pigeonhole app. Link and passcodes are below the live stream window on your screens. We might not get through all of the questions today, so just to ensure that we ask the questions with the widest reach, please vote for the questions you'd like to be asked. And any unanswered questions today, Charlotte and her team have kindly agreed to address them post-session. So my first question, I'll come back to you, Charlotte. The 4-day work week, it's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it? Because this is really about a meaningful reduction in work time. So can you tell us a bit more about the model of the 4-day work week and how that works, and maybe touch on different business types?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it is a bit of a marketing clickbait. It's easier to call yourself 4-day week global than reduce working time global. So realistically, what we're talking about is a meaningful reduction in work time, ideally 20%, which is the equivalent of a 4-day week. And most of the companies in the early stages, that's what they did. They basically took Fridays off. But for a lot of modern companies and global companies, that's just an impossible ask. And certainly at Perpetual Guardian, that's not what we're doing either. So we developed the 180-100 principle, which is recognises that people get paid 100%, but is 80% time as long as you are delivering, 100% productivity. And so that allows you to find ways to reduce work time in your business. Arguably, for a standard 40-hour week, that means you're trying to reduce down to a 32-hour week. It also takes into consideration that not all of your employees work a standard week. Some of them may already be working less hours, but of course, there's a lot of us working more hours. And I remember having a conversation with a CEO of an organisation. He says, I don't know how I get down to 32 hours because I know on average my people are working 53 hours. So I said, well, let's just try and get them down to 40. So it's about understanding that the amount of value we put on time at work is having an overall impact on so many aspects of it, our personal lives, our health, our society, our planet, and it's impacting on our ability to unlock the gender balance issue as well. So if we can find ways of valuing productivity better in an organisation, then people can actually go out and have time. And particularly on the gender thing, which is sort of a bit of a passion point for me. So we've done so much to pull women up in the workplace, but we've not done enough to help our men out of the workplace. And so by making reduced time the norm for everyone, we're actually giving our men an opportunity to spend more time with care duties and responsibilities. And Juliet and John will be able to talk to what we see in our findings with that.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. So we've got a question coming through on Pigeonhole here, which is asking, what are some of the teething issues that companies are experiencing when they trial the 4-day work week for the first time?
Juliet, do you want to talk to that first?
Sure, but I missed the word. What issues?
Teething issues.
One more time.
Teething issues.
Teething. Oh, like a baby teething?
Yes. Okay. Sorry, it might be an Antipodean saying. What are some of the problems that people find when they are first doing this? No, that was Antipodean.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just preface this by saying the vast majority are finding it, they're getting 2 months of coaching and mentoring and workshops and peer support from 4-Day Week Global. So they're not just sort of going into it blind, and they're really getting really creative and figuring out a lot of things about how to do it. I would say that one of the things we're finding in our qualitative data is companies that are operating a little bit on a knife edge with no excess capacity at all, and they're barely keeping it together. Some of these are startups where there's a really intense pace of work. And if you're a manager, a very senior person, you're the buck stops here kind of person, you may just really not, you may have already kind of re-engineered your work to make your days so efficient. So I just did an interview with someone who was kind of in that space. The other people in the firm were able to reduce. He found himself catching up on Fridays. So we do have a small group of people who aren't managing to reduce their work time in these firms, even if the vast majority do. So that's one of the issues.
Thank you.
And I think, just in terms of what I see when I'm talking to companies internationally, is it's not so much a teething problem, but one of the things that going through a process where you're focusing in on productivity and you're partnering with your people in a truly meaningful way, it's a massive team building exercise. But you might then see that you see the weaknesses within your business, and you need to understand that you're going to have to start plugging them. Now, those are weaknesses that exist anyway. So an example of that might be strengths in your management or leadership team in terms of their skill set and for managing change and creating a process by where they perhaps need to upskill and have confidence in what they do. So it's an example of that. So as Andrew just it shines a spotlight on your business. Now, fix those because you want to fix those anyway, right?
And Charlotte, I remember reading from the report that there was a lot of catalysts for innovations within business, wasn't there, when you went through this process? So perhaps Juliet or Charlotte, you can talk to one or two of those examples.
Yes, so I think that the sort of innovations that people look at is they start using the software that they already have. I mean, how many of us use, for example, the Microsoft suite of products properly? But also staff, Parkinson's law says that a job gets done in the time that you make available. So when you reduce time, your staff start to look at actually, how can I do things better? And so they will start engaging with you and saying, look, we have this particular module in the software we're not using. I need people to better use that. Or there's a systemic thing that we need to do here. These are all business improvement things for your organization. You can choose to do nothing about them and stay on a 5-day week, or you can do something about them and actually end up with what I describe as the delicious circle of happiness within your business, where you've got happy staff who are happy at home, and then they bring happy home person to work. And so it starts to circle round. Our researcher, and Juliet and John, you can maybe talk to this as much, but Brendan, our researcher at Cambridge, has said to me, please don't stop doing this. He says, I've spent my life studying these people, talking to people about workplace practices and happiness at work. This is the first project where I've ever talked to happy people.
That's amazing. Thank you. John, I might come to you next. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was, just in March, we had the final report of the Senate Select Committee on Work and Care. And that talked about, structural reforms to the architecture of Australia's work and care systems. And if we did make those structural reforms, we'd see social and economic benefits, but that a whole of government response is required. And this work mentions that, some global governments have sponsored trials, and I just wondered whether that was a good idea, and could you imagine that there'd be appetite from government in Australia to do that?
Sure. Well, this process is somewhat unusual in the sense that it's companies taking the lead, whereas historically the push has come largely from unions and then backed up by government to a certain extent. And of course, governments themselves, as large employers, historically have been leaders in introducing working conditions. The Whitlam government, for example, created a bunch of conditions like maternity leave and so forth. So the fact that we've seen this coming primarily from companies reflects, of course, the decline in the strength of the union movement and a reconfiguration of the role of government to some extent. But I think we're going to see governments, particularly in their role as employers, starting to look at these kinds of developments. We're seeing, I think, across a range of things, with the combination of full employment and the realisation following the pandemic lockdowns that we can do things differently, that there's going to be more and more pressure. And that's I think, reflected in the interests of governments as employers. And we're also seeing, I think, within the union movement, a bit of tension between a continuing push for more flexibility for workers, less on-demand flexibility that employers have to demand workers turn up at a specific time, things like the Your Rights at Work campaign, versus still a significant tradition of valorisation of work, that more work, more jobs, more hours is always good. So I think we're seeing this is an interesting process with the 4-day week. And of course, we've also seen with remote work, essentially individual employees just taking the initiative, saying, I'm not coming in. And lots of managers have found that confronting, but in the end, even the biggest of them have really in the end said, well, most of them have at least said, well, if this person leaves, I won't be able to get anybody else, and the job seems to be being done, I'll let sleeping dogs lie.
And globally, we are seeing a lot of governments connecting into us. So we're running a pilot program for the Portuguese government. We've got various things going on for local and regional governments in Spain. And the US has 6 states at the moment that are putting up bills around running pilots, and Mark Takano has a federal bill around a 32-hour work week. There is also a private member's bill in the UK. So those are the ones that are known in the media, but we are having conversations with governments and local and regional around the globe. So that is a very 2023 existence. A few 2022 conversations, but 2023 has certainly seen that expedited.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Even in Australia.
One of the questions I'm sure that you get lots is, or comments that you get a lot is, well, this couldn't possibly work in my sector. I can see how that could work in an office environment, but in my sector, it couldn't happen. And we've got a question here in Pigeonhole that specifically asks, how could you see this 4-day work week working in the school education sector? So could I invite, perhaps I'll start with John and then come to you, Charlotte, on that.
Sure. Well, first point is the most progress towards this goal was in the construction sector, where lots of workers got a 9-day fortnight. That's halfway there with a rostered on arrangement. So I think while it's true that remote work, for example, is something which clearly works in an office environment, is much more difficult to handle elsewhere. The idea that you can't run a production, physical production business with shorter hours, I think goes against all history. And Juliet's already made this point. I think when we look at schools and things like this, it's important to remember the weight of this last 40 years is this is the way it's always been. Nothing can change. I mean, the pandemic showed dramatically how things could change. Really, if somebody had said, look, I want to have work from home, but I won't have any preparation, I'll just call people up over the course of the weekend and say, don't come in on Monday, the office is closed, do you work from home? I think people would have predicted a total economic collapse, whereas in fact, we took over without a beat. And what I'm saying here is, if we move to a standard 4-day week across the economy, we can adjust the way schools work away from what's traditionally been a 5-day week. We can think about having more online work, for example. We can think about possibly a slightly longer school day, but there's nothing. If we look at the school day around the world, it varies greatly. The school year, rather, it varies very greatly from place to place. So the assumption that we need 9 to 3, 5 days a week, or we can't do school, I think reflects just, well, this is the way it's been for a long time, not this is the way it has to be forever.
And I think some of it sits into what is the societal change. I mean, for a large part, school is also babysitting. So there is some social change that needs to come in. There are a number of school districts in the US that are running on 4 days, and we actually have a consultant coming on board who has supported schools shifting successfully over decades for them shifting to shorter work time. So that's an area that we will be able to work with. We also get people go, it'll never work in manufacturing, it'll never work in law, it'll never work in healthcare, and yet there are lawyers, schools, manufacturers, healthcare organisations that have managed to reduce work time. The difference is the agility in the leadership thinking. And hospitality is another one. One of the greatest advocates for the 4-day week in Spain is a woman who has 4 restaurants. And her answer to the question is, it's easier than you think. So it comes down to being prepared. Henry Ford, who is accredited with bringing in the 5-day week, is also accredited with saying, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you are right.
Maybe if I could come in, one point on this, which is to say that I think if we only think right now, particularly only think in terms of, can we make up the productivity for the reduced hours, we're not understanding the totality of what's going on in labor markets, because there are big savings to be had in the ability to retain employees. And that's one of the things we're saying. The very first company who joined our trials was a company they're in the healthcare sector in the Western US, and they were losing large numbers of people. And they just sort of, practically on the spur of the moment said, you know what, we're going to go to the 4 days. And they stopped losing people. And it's also much, much easier to attract talent. And so there are huge savings to be had for employers in this labor market with a 4-day week.
Just maybe following up a bit on that, I mean, when you look at things like healthcare, law and so forth, the issue really isn't that the inherent nature of the process requires long hours. It's that those industries have a culture of presenteeism, long hours and so forth, which reflected not only in, reflected not so much in turnover between employers, because it's very common, but in very high levels of burnout. The health sector runs on long hours, dedication and so forth, and then wonders why half the people who've been educated as nurses are no longer nurses. And we see that kind of thing across that we're really talking in many cases not about the technical difficulties of organising the job, but about a culture in which overwork is valued.
Thanks, John. One of the questions that's come through on Pigeonhole, which I think is quite interesting, and Juliet, I might come to you on this. During the trials, did you see any impacts on workplace culture? due to an increased intensity or focus across reduced hours. The person who's posted the question comments that social connections are obviously really important at work for relationships, for collaboration. So what did you see there?
So in terms of the first part of the question, workplace culture, focus, et cetera, there's a lot that companies are doing. Many of them are putting in very intentional focus periods or putting in systems to reduce distraction, because one of the things they're finding is that people are distracted by all sorts of things. They're distracted by their colleagues, they're distracted by their machines and so forth. We're hearing mixed things, I would say, about the social connection piece. Some of the companies are a little concerned about this, and so they're taking very deliberate steps to make sure that they keep as much social glue in their workplaces as they had before. So they're, some of them are doing innovative things in terms of scheduling in more deliberate socializing and that sort of thing. And I think part of what's happening also is they're getting more shared purpose, because that period of time at the beginning where they, those 2 months where they try and figure out how they can make this happen. As John was saying earlier, it's both a question of, okay, let's just get more efficient with what we're doing. So we're going to have shorter meetings and, we're going to have focus time and so forth. That's sort of the easy part of it. But then the companies that kind of, and Charlotte was mentioning this also, that sort of do more, and they really kind of think about all those things that they probably should have changed before and just never got around to, sort of new priorities and new initiatives, or getting rid of the things they're doing that aren't adding value. That creates a lot of common mission, shared purpose. And I think that's part of why, people are so happy, as Charlotte said, they're happy outside of work because they have so much more time. They're happier inside work because everybody's pulling together. I think they are the ones who are sort of concerned about that social piece are taking affirmative steps to address it.
Thanks, Juliet. I've got a couple of questions coming through, which I might kind of group together as maybe terms and conditions. Questions around, what happens when you've got workers who are part-time workers? What happens when you've got people who are shift workers? How does this impact leave entitlements and public holidays? So I might group those together as a terms and conditions question. Maybe you can take that, Charlotte.
Yes, so Australian labour legislation is not terribly different from New Zealand labour legislation. And certainly there are, if you download our original white paper from the Perpetual Guardian experience, you will see a lot of what we did. So, and around the globe, people do it differently, but you can choose not to change your employment contracts, and people are just
we just seem to be having a couple of technical issues.
Connected for 40 hours a week. You might find that in terms of how you deal with leave, if you're not changing your 40 hours, they're just having 40 hours. In terms of part-time people or people who are working, it's 180, 100. So what we did at Perpetual Guardian, we didn't change the 40 hours or 37 and a half. People opt in. Australian and New Zealand labour legislation does not allow you to force your people to change without changing employment contracts. But then around the globe, lots of people actually do put that effort in to change employment contracts. If you're a large organisation with unions and a complex structure, that will take time to do. If you're a smaller organisation, it might not take much time at all. But the key thing that we're recommending here is run a pilot and find out how increasing or focusing in on productivity, focusing in on your people, and process will allow you to reduce work time, and what that will look like before you worry about a permanent structure that you need to follow once you have done that. And so that some of that is it's a lower bar to have to, a higher bar to have to get under, a lower bar to get over, is actually just running a pilot and working it out. And the great thing about the Select Committee with Work and Income, of course, is that we've now got government types looking at this and being aware of how that might impact in terms of a legislative framework. But it's really important. This is why, for example, the Portuguese government are running the pilot program, is because they want to understand, what does reducing work time look like for Portugal? And so in Australia, it might even be statewide pilot programs, and establishing what does it look like for our economy, what does it look like for our people, before we worry too much about the legal side of it.
Might just invite you to any further comments there, John, from the Australian perspective.
Sure. I think, well, one point is that as Australia's organised, the conditions of standard full-time workers typically flow on to part-time workers. So if we move to 180, 100 model for full-time workers, that implies an increase in hourly rates, which part-time workers would then get either as higher pay if they kept on working the same hours, or also getting shorter hours for the same time. And of course, the gender issue has been raised, and it's a pretty common pattern, I guess, in Australia to have one typically the male partner in a household working full-time and the female partner working part-time. So I think there's going to be lots of shuffling around for households. And the same point with shift work, of course. I mean, by the nature of shift work, we can just say, well, look, if we have 4/5 the amount of work per worker, we essentially need 20% more shifts. It's up to managers then to organise how those shifts happen. And at this point, we're certainly, I think, going to need to move beyond individual company initiatives towards unions and towards actually implementing these things. The other point I'd make is that work-life balance problem is particularly acute for shift workers. So they're a group who really could benefit a lot from this kind of change. And fly in, fly out, I guess, is another category where we really see some really big negative consequences, and people are getting good money, but the consequences of long hours of work have been pretty severe, and that possibly has to be addressed in its own terms. But I think part of this story is just saying, just stop a moment. We're much richer than we were 40 years ago. Why are we having family breakdown because people are too busy to spend time with their partners, with their kids, and so forth?
Thanks, John. I think if we were designing our workplace now, we definitely would not be designing it the same way.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of kind of linked questions. So I might go to Juliet first and then follow up with Charlotte. There's one question, which is, the studies were done at the end of 2022. What are the plans for longitudinal follow-up to see if implemented reforms stick? And then the other part of that question is, how likely is it, because I think they're linked, how likely is it that a 4-day work week will become a cultural norm? And when do you predict it becoming a majority? Get your crystal ball out, Julia and Charlotte.
Yeah. Great question. So on the first question, we recently sent out a baseline plus 12 months, so a 1 year later survey, so 6 months after the pilot stopped, and we are still trying to get those results in. We just have that first pilot, and we're just about ready to send out to the second. So that's a to be determined. We know that we've only heard of a few cases of companies who 6 months in plan to continue, and then didn't. One, I'm sorry to say, is actually a global company headquartered in Australia that was bought up by a private equity firm who canceled the 4-day schedule. It was very successful. So that's, that's just something that occasionally happens. Your second question was, remind me?
The second question was, when do we think that the 4-day work week might become?
Oh, yeah. When will it be? So I think by the end of the decade, we're going to see it in lots of countries. It's going to be kind of normal. What's happening now, I would say, is an evolution in that direction. John mentioned the 9, every other week you get a day off. In the US, you have summers, which are turning into times when more companies are giving 4 days or early short days on Fridays. You also have no meeting Fridays, where people are just taking their time back from their employers, and they're just sort of evolving. In my world, which is higher education, the fraction of classes on Fridays has really plummeted. So you have a lot of places that some schools don't even have regular classes on Fridays. So I think we're well on the way.
Yeah, and interestingly, of course, as the millennials and Gen Z start to become a greater part of our workforce, they want a different way of working, and we as their business leaders, and possibly their parents, actually, more likely, we have to recognise that there is a different way of working that is coming. I'm with Juliet. I think there will be significant. We've seen a significant change even just in the last year. So the last year is still impacted by post-pandemic, but I think we're post-pandemic now, and so just the movement and the conversations that we're having around the world, I think there is a general acceptance from governments and from businesses that reducing work time is part of the future, and so therefore it's logistically. It's just about the logistics of getting there. There was, however, very sadly, from my perspective, an article in the New Zealand Herald yesterday, which is titled "The Rising Daycare Costs Keeping New Zealand Mums Out of Work." And I think that there is actually a real recognition that our society needs to balance some of these things, and the millennials and the Gen Zs are completely all over that. There will be a whole lot more dads out of work because of rising childcare costs as our society moves forward. So part of what we're doing, we work with businesses and now a lot more governments around on how we do that from an institutional side of things. But there is a societal shift that needs to come along, and I think more and more people are beginning to understand that it's a good idea because of the social benefits that will come out of it, the climate change benefits, and all of those things that we want. So wouldn't it be great by 2030 we have our children being brought up by either parent? There is much more parental involvement in our children, that our aged care problem is actually because is diminished because we are looking after our aged ourselves. We have time. I mean, all of this AI conversation and chat bots and whatever it's called. You can see I'm a Gen Z, a Gen X. It's going to steal all of our jobs. And so where are we going to find the time to upskill and change what we're doing if we're so busy working in our jobs, working in our businesses? And actually, one of our other researchers, Brenda Birchall from Cambridge, he has done research on how much work we actually need as humans to feel happy and fulfilled. And so there are real conversations around what is the society that we want. So the research that John and Juliet do as part of what we're doing starts to highlight that. I mean, one of the pieces of information that came out of comes out of our research is the reduction in insomnia.
Yeah.
And if you think about that, that means that we're less stressed and we're less fatigued. There's a whole pile of stuff that's about here and now. But actually, quality and quantity of sleep means we will live longer.
And we're back to that happy circle, aren't we, Charlotte?
Yeah, so there's just so much there that is just, what is the Australia that we want?
I want to pick up on one of the threads and come to John with that. A really interesting question has come through around how do you see the shift towards a 4-day work week being impacted or coexisting with the rise of AI in the workplace and its impact on the labour market?
Sure. Well, wanted to link that to remote work from home and say, while I would have thought until recently this was going to be a long way off, we're already seeing, I think, the emergence of a sort of core week. Tuesday to Thursday is the core week, Saturday and Sunday is the weekend, and Monday and Friday are this kind of penumbra. And so that doesn't mean people aren't working Mondays and Fridays, but it certainly means it's ceasing to be the case that you can say, look, we're going to have an all-hands meeting, 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and everyone will be there. That just can't be done anymore. And so I think that's a lot of that is to do with communications technology, of course, but it's not purely technologically driven. Zoom is a bit nicer than Skype, but Skype was around 20 years ago. We could really have done this 20 years ago if we had chosen to. And I think AI will see what effect. Some of it I think is a little overblown, but I think it does mean, I think, that we can expect to see continuing productivity growth, which is something there was a lot of concern, I think, that, nothing more remained to be discovered and so forth. That means we can delegate more routine work to AI bots and so forth. And probably, I think, gets away from the high-powered superstar model of work, where there are a few really high-powered people who do all the stuff. AI really benefits people who are okay, but not great at putting their thoughts on paper, for example. When I try and do it and say, I want to write an opinion piece, I look and think this is just terrible. But if you're saying, look, I have to send out 50 slightly different letters to people about whatever it is I'm sending letters about, AI is going to turn that stuff out greatly. And so I think what we'll see is a continuation in productivity growth. What we see, I think, over 100 plus years is, of course, it's not that the amount of work expands to fill the time available, but that what this does is provide us with more choices. We can choose to produce more and consume more, or we can choose to take some of this time, some more of this time away from work. The other point I want to make about meaningful work, I guess, is one of the things driving this is steadily increasing expectations of what people should be putting into parenting in particular. That back in the day, if your dad threw the ball around a bit on Saturday afternoon, you're doing well. Clearly, although there's plenty of gender imbalance there's much bigger expectations of parenting, and of parenting as being as much meaningful work as participating in the paid workforce.
Thanks, John. I have a question here for you, Juliet. Someone said that their state is experiencing a massive skills shortage. Will a 4-day work week exacerbate or alleviate the problem, do you think?
A massive
skills shortage.
Oh, well, it's hard to be very precise about this, but what I would say is that a lot of what the 4-day week activity is doing is making people more productive. And so therefore that suggests alleviating skill shortages, because it means people can do more. I mean, as Charlotte mentioned, I think one of the big things that's happened, particularly not just in white collar work, workplaces, but also in manufacturing, we know this happened. Companies get these new technologies and it takes them a long time to figure out how to use them effectively, and they don't always do that. So the 4-day week is a little bit of a forcing mechanism there. I can envision some industries, some occupations. I think about doctors and nurses right now who are really burning out, and you're not going to get more work out of them in 4 days for the most part. They're not going to that many meetings, but you can actually save money by treating them well and hiring some new people. So there may be some specific occupations where it could exacerbate, but I think in general it will probably go in the other direction. Key thing, I mean, and this is true long before this movement, and looking at productivity and work time over many, many decades, if not centuries, shorter hours of work leads to higher per hour productivity, and in some cases, even higher total productivity. So really important to remember that.
One of the things that the pieces of advice I gave at industry sector when there was various inquiries going on in Australia was, if your state announced it was doing a 4-day week or reducing work time for, let's pick an industry, healthcare, do you think your state would be the state that was short of staff? Everyone would come to that state. You would have, if we're picking healthcare, doctors and nurses from around the world going, I'm going to go work there. Because as John has pointed out, one of our biggest issues with staffing something like healthcare is worker burnout and people leaving, highly qualified, expensive people leaving the industry because the industry doesn't provide them with a workplace that they want to be in. If you announced a 4-day week in your industry, in your state, you would have immigration solve your problem in 5 seconds flat.
Could I comment? Historically, it's skill shortages that produce shorter working hours. The reason New Zealand and Australia, we can fight about which of them did it first, but the reason workers in New Zealand and Australia in the mid-19th century got shorter working hours than people back home was precisely because people like stonemasons were in short supply. And when we look at skill shortages, what we really mean is full employment. What we really mean is that in the past, if you advertised a job, there'd be a queue of people outside the door and you could pick and choose. Now you can't, and if you want the best workers, you have to offer them better conditions. So that might not be, it's clearly uncomfortable for a lot of people engaged in hiring that's become a lot more difficult. But I think the logic of the market is going to say a 4-day week is part of the solution to that, not part of the problem.
One of the questions that's got a few votes, we've answered this in part, I think, but I think it's a question worth asking. What do you think are some of the myths that need busting about the 4-day or reduced work week? Charlotte.
It's not Fridays off is the first one. We've discussed that. It's 180-100. It is about agile leadership and being able to think it. One of the biggest problems we have, and there'll be a number of people in this thing, is that leaders tend to try and overthink it. You are merely running a pilot, and the pilot is going to provide you with the solutions. So your pilot doesn't have to get everything right on day one. The pilot is about howing. So all that a business leader needs to do is go, I like the idea of giving this a go. And I'm going to work with and trust my people to do a great job of running a pilot to see whether we can make it go. So this is, and then Juliet and John and the rest of our academic team, they come in and they help you measure that. They help you see what's going on there. And then our team are there to help. And we have a whole international community that people can learn from and be part of. So it's actually, the myth is that you today I'm a 5-day week company and tomorrow I'm not. it's a journey. Even Henry Ford, when he brought in the 5-day work week into his business, it took him 3 years. It doesn't necessarily, and if you look at Unilever, they've done 18 months in New Zealand. They're now doing a period of time in Australia. It'll probably take them, as Juliet has suggested, through till 2030 to actually roll it out around the world, because they're just determined to take their time and get it right.
Terrific. Thank you.
I think, if I can answer this question, the ones I hear are, you can do it in white collar work, but you can't do it in healthcare. You can't do it in manufacturing. You can't do it in companies that have billable hours. You can't do it with blue collar workers. You can't do it with hourly workers. Those are the things I hear. And, I think our work is showing that none of those things are true.
Yeah, for me, the big myth is the weekend, 2 days, is natural, always has been, always will be. The weekend was the product of lots of struggle and hard work, and whatever form the 4-day week takes, once we have it, we'll see that as much more natural. We'll see that as natural in the way that we currently see 5 and 2.
Now we have time for only one more question, and I'll group 2 questions together that have got a lot of votes. They are, what's the best source of statistics or data to convince my CEO to run a trial? And the other question was, what would be the best way to approach my manager to have a conversation about having a 4-day work week introduced? So they're really 2 directions for the same question. So if I can ask each of you in turn to give us your thoughts on that.
Juliet, do you want to talk to the statistics?
Oh, well, go to the 4-day week global website. We have our reports there. They've got all the findings from the trials that have been completed. And, as each trial ends, we put out more data and statistics. So that's there. And, we are now going to there'll be more and more academic papers and so forth. But the website has lots of great stats.
Thanks, Julie.
And I think in terms of, so we also have a how to convince your boss a little bit, so feel free to do that. But at its heart, each manager has their own, or boss has their own things that are important to them. But in the end, most of them are, they have to report to shareholders or other key stakeholders around certain metrics, often profit. So you actually need to understand from your boss, what are the things that they need to prove to the people they're responsible for. And if your boss is the major shareholder, then it's about what matters to them, and then finding the information within the statistics or the information that's on our website that talks to what is important to them. So if it's profits, well, it is, the research shows that this doesn't have an impact on profits. In fact, it'll probably make your business more profitable. If it's employee health and well-being, well, to be fair, you're already doing a 4-day week if that's the case. And then understanding also what might be some of their fears. The biggest thing that leadership people struggle with is, oh my God, that sounds like a lot of work for me. So being able to lean into how that workload can be shared, being able to join one of our pilot programs so that we can help and assist. There are all sorts of things. John, you want to jump in as well?
Well, I mean, I think in the particular situation we're now in, we've had quite a lot of inflation and lots of people's wages haven't kept up. And for lots of people, we'd need something like a 10% increase in nominal wages to get them back on the track they were before. Lots of employers are very tightly constrained. Public sector employers certainly can't go out handing out 10% wage increases, even if real wages have fallen that much. So I think this is a time when I think individual or collective, we can say to employers, well, you've had this big gain that my wages have fallen behind prices. For a bunch of reasons, it doesn't look like you can increase wages now. So this is the time this is the time to give me something else, and the something else is the 4-day week.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Well, there's a few messages that I've taken from today. It's easier than you think. The numbers don't lie. In reading the report, some of the headline numbers for me were 90% of employees said they definitely wanted to continue their 4-day work week. 55% reported an increase in their ability. I found that number astounding. And 15% said no amount of money would make them accept a 5-day work week schedule at their next job. So I think we've heard today that it's not only desirable, but it's very achievable to introduce this into your workplaces. Charlotte, if any of our live stream participants are interested in conducting a trial or learning more, how can they get in touch?
So our website is 4dayweek.com. That's the number 4. We will be running an Australasian pilot very shortly. There'll be announcements coming up about that, which allows you to join a group of businesses that will all be piloting at the same time. Juliet and John and our team research anyone who is piloting at any time, and we have a global community that whether you're a part of a group pilot program or whether you're doing it in any other way, you become part of the global community, and so you will always have people that you'll be able to ask questions of. You'll always have our team to be able to engage with. So 4-day week, and feel free to connect with any of us on LinkedIn, and Juliet's big on Twitter as well, so follow there.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I would like to thank Juliet, Charlotte, and John for their time and participation today. Thank you so much for joining us here at CEDA. You can watch a replay of today's discussion via the same link, which will also be available on CEDA's website publicly in around 1 week. Do stay in touch with upcoming events, research, education programs and discussions via ceda.com.au. Our next live stream is with the Honourable Chris Bowen, Rewiring the Nation, on Monday the 15th of May. Thanks again for your questions and your participation online, and enjoy the rest of your day.